China produces more honey than any other country on Earth, and it is not particularly close. In most years, Chinese honey output outpaces the next largest producer by a wide margin, and has done so consistently for decades. Behind that single statistic sits an enormous, highly organized agricultural system spanning millions of managed hives, a workforce of migratory beekeepers who move with the seasons like modern-day nomads, and a production and export network that touches nearly every corner of the globe, from the honey jar on a European breakfast table to the sweetener stirred into tea across Southeast Asia. Understanding how this system works and how it grew to this scale means starting with the geography that made it possible in the first place. China's dominance in honey production is not an accident of industrial policy alone. It begins with an extraordinary diversity of climate and terrain packed into a single country, stretching from subtropical river valleys in the south to temperate mountain ranges in the interior. Provinces like Yunnan, Guangxi, and Sichuan sit at the center of the country's beekeeping industry precisely because they combine rich, varied vegetation with the kind of extended flowering seasons that most other honey-producing regions simply cannot match. Where a beekeeper in a temperate northern climate might get a single concentrated nectar flow lasting a few weeks each spring, a beekeeper working across China's varied landscape can chase blooming seasons across an enormous range of latitude and altitude, moving from one flowering region to the next as the calendar turns. This is the foundation of what is often called migratory or nomadic beekeeping. And in China, it operates on a scale that dwarfs similar practices found almost anywhere else in the world. Rather than keeping a fixed set of hives in one location year-round, many Chinese beekeepers load their colonies onto trucks and follow the bloom, chasing canola fields in one province, acacia forests in another, and longan or lychee orchards in a third, sometimes covering thousands of kilometers over the course of a single production season. Each stop along this route produces a honey with a distinct flavor profile tied directly to whichever flower was dominant at that location and moment, turning the beekeeper's annual migration into something closer to a curated tour through the country's agricultural calendar than a single fixed harvest. The economic logic behind this constant movement is straightforward, even if the practice itself is demanding. A stationary hive can only produce as much honey as the flowers within flying range allow, and once a local bloom fades, production slows dramatically until the next flowering cycle begins. A migratory operation, by contrast, keeps its colonies working at peak nectar flow almost continuously, moving to fresh floral resources exactly when the previous ones start to decline. This is why individual worker bees within a single hive can end up flying an extraordinary cumulative distance over the course of their working lives collecting nectar. And it is one of the central reasons a single kilogram of finished honey represents so much accumulated flight, foraging, and processing effort spread across an enormous number of individual bees. China's beekeeping workforce reflects the scale and demands of this system. The country is home to millions of managed honeybee colonies, tended by a large population of professional and semi-professional beekeepers, many of whom have inherited the trade across multiple generations within the same family. For these beekeepers, managing a hive goes far beyond simply placing boxes near a field and returning weeks later to collect honey. A colony that is thriving requires constant attention, monitoring for disease, ensuring access to clean water, and during lean periods between blooms, actively supplementing the bee's diet with sugar syrup or protein-rich pollen substitutes to keep the colony strong enough to resume full production once flowers return. Beekeepers also regularly inspect, clean, and replace the wax comb frames inside each hive, since older comb can harbor disease and reduce the efficiency of the colony's honey storage capacity. In effect, professional beekeeping in China blends the roles of livestock caretaker, agricultural technician, and mobile logistics operator into a single, highly demanding seasonal occupation. The honey harvesting season in most of China's key production regions runs roughly from March through October, tracking the sequence of blooms as spring moves north and as different crops and wild flora come into flower across the country's varied terrain. Canola fields represent one of the earliest and most significant nectar sources of the year, followed later by acacia forests, and eventually by fruit tree blossoms, including longan and lychee in the country's southern regions. Each of these floral sources produces honey with distinctly different color, viscosity, and flavor. And Chinese honey buyers, much like wine buyers evaluating a vintage by region, have developed strong preferences for honey sourced from specific floral origins, driving beekeepers to plan their migratory routes with real precision around which blooms will be most valuable to reach at the right moment. Determining exactly when to harvest is itself a skill built on careful observation. A healthy, well-managed hive can house tens of thousands of individual bees, and as those bees process collected nectar into finished honey, they seal the completed cells of the honeycomb with a thin layer of beeswax, a sign that the moisture content inside has dropped low enough for the honey to be considered fully ripened and stable for long-term storage. Experienced beekeepers judge harvest timing largely by observing what percentage of the honeycomb has been capped in this way, generally aiming to harvest once the great majority of cells show this beeswax seal, since harvesting too early risks pulling honey that still carries excess moisture and is prone to fermentation. Increasingly, larger operations in China have moved beyond visual inspection alone, adopting handheld spectrometers and other moisture measurement instruments that allow beekeepers to verify honey ripeness with far greater precision than observation by eye alone can provide. A small but meaningful example of how traditional beekeeping knowledge and modern agricultural technology have merged within the country's honey industry. Once a hive is judged ready, the harvesting process itself follows a sequence refined over generations, even as the tools involved have modernized considerably. Beekeepers dress in protective clothing, gloves, and a veil to guard against stings, and use gentle smoke, or, in some more modern operations, controlled bursts of steam to calm the colony and encourage the bees to temporarily move away from the honeycomb frames without triggering an aggressive defensive response. With the bees cleared, the frames are carefully removed from the hive body, taking care not to damage the delicate wax structure the colony has built. Specialized uncapping tools, or automated uncapping machines, then slice away the thin wax seal covering each honey-filled cell, exposing the liquid honey inside while leaving the surrounding comb structure largely intact, since an undamaged comb can often be returned to the hive for the bees to refill in a future cycle, rather than being rebuilt entirely from scratch. The uncapped frames are then loaded into a centrifugal extractor, a machine that spins the frames at speed to fling the liquid honey outward against the walls of a drum, where it collects and drains away from the comb without physically crushing or destroying the wax structure in the process. This method, largely unchanged in its basic mechanical principle since it was first developed in the 19th century, remains the standard extraction technique used across the vast majority of Chinese honey operations today, scaled up in larger commercial facilities to process enormous volumes of frames in rapid succession. What emerges from that extractor, however, is still very far from the finished product that eventually reaches a store shelf or an export container. Raw honey, straight from the extraction process, carries a range of impurities. Fragments of beeswax, stray grains of pollen, and small pieces of organic debris that inevitably end up mixed in during harvesting. Turning that raw, extracted material into a stable, market-ready product requires a further sequence of filtration, moisture reduction, and, in many cases, heat treatment, each step carrying its own trade-offs between shelf stability and the preservation of honey's more delicate natural qualities. That processing stage, and the surprising amount of disagreement it has generated among beekeepers, food scientists, and international regulators alike, is exactly where the next part of this story continues. Once raw honey leaves the centrifugal extractor, it enters the part of the production process that generates the most disagreement within the entire industry. And that disagreement centers on a single question with no universally accepted answer. How much processing is too much? The raw honey coming off the frame still carries fragments of beeswax, stray pollen grains, air bubbles, and small pieces of organic debris picked up during harvesting, none of which are harmful in any meaningful sense, but all of which affect the honey's clarity, texture, and shelf appearance in ways that most commercial buyers consider undesirable in a finished product. Removing them requires a filtration process, and the intensity of that filtration is where the industry begins to split into genuinely different philosophies of what honey should be. At one end of that spectrum sits minimally processed raw honey, filtered only lightly to remove larger debris while leaving fine pollen grains and other microscopic natural components largely intact. This is the style of honey generally favored across much of Europe, where consumer preference, and in many cases regulatory standards, lean toward preserving honey in a form closer to what comes directly out of the hive. At the other end sits more heavily processed honey, run through finer filtration and often subjected to a pasteurization step, generally involving heating the honey to somewhere in the range of 60 to 65 degrees Celsius for approximately half an hour, a temperature and duration intended to kill off any residual yeast or bacteria that could otherwise cause the honey to ferment over time, particularly if its moisture content isn't brought down far enough during processing. China's honey industry, operating at an enormous production scale and serving both a massive domestic market and a large export trade, has generally leaned toward the more heavily processed end of that spectrum, though the picture is far from uniform across the country's many thousands of individual operations. Larger commercial processing facilities frequently apply pasteurization as a standard step, reasoning that consistent heat treatment protects against spoilage risk across huge production volumes moving through long supply chains, sometimes traveling great distances and sitting in storage for extended periods before reaching a final buyer. Critics of this approach, including some beekeepers and nutrition-focused researchers, argue that the heat involved in pasteurization can degrade some of the natural enzymes and heat-sensitive nutrients present in raw honey. Enzymes like invertase and glucose oxidase that play a direct role in honey's natural antimicrobial properties, meaning the very process meant to protect honey from spoilage may also strip away some of the qualities that made it naturally resistant to spoilage in the first place. It's a genuine tension within food science rather than a settled question, and it's one that reasonable producers and researchers land on differently. Some of China's larger, more specialized honey operations have adopted an alternative approach specifically to sidestep this trade-off: cold membrane filtration. Rather than relying on heat to control moisture and microbial risk, cold filtration passes honey through extremely fine membranes capable of removing much finer particulate matter than standard filtration, all without raising the honey's temperature and without the enzyme degradation that heat treatment can cause. The trade-off here is cost. Cold membrane filtration equipment is considerably more expensive to install and operate than conventional filtration or pasteurization lines, which means it remains concentrated among larger, more capital-intensive operations rather than being standard practice across the industry's smaller and mid-sized beekeeping businesses, many of which still rely on more traditional filtration and heat-based processing, simply because it remains the more economically accessible option. Whichever filtration method is used, nearly every commercial honey operation in China treats moisture reduction as a critical, non-negotiable step in the process, and for good reason. Honey with a moisture content above roughly 20% becomes vulnerable to fermentation, since at that hydration level, wild yeasts present in trace amounts, even in properly harvested honey, can begin actively growing, breaking down sugars and producing off flavors, carbonation, and eventually spoilage. Bringing that moisture content down below approximately 18% is generally considered the threshold needed for genuinely long-term shelf stability, and most large-scale Chinese operations achieve this using vacuum evaporation equipment, which allows water to be drawn out of the honey at lower temperatures than would otherwise be required, reducing the amount of heat exposure the honey experiences during this stage compared to open evaporation methods. This is also the underlying reason properly processed and stored honey can remain edible for such an extraordinarily long time. Since honey's combination of low moisture content, naturally acidic pH, and inherent antimicrobial compounds creates an environment that is simply inhospitable to the microorganisms that cause most other foods to spoil. Once filtration and moisture reduction are complete, the finished honey moves into packaging, typically glass jars for premium retail products, or larger plastic containers for bulk and food service distribution, with some larger operations employing aseptic packaging technology designed to further extend shelf stability and protect the product from contamination during storage and transport. From here, Chinese honey enters both an enormous domestic market and a substantial export trade, reaching countries across Asia, Europe, and North America, where it competes directly with honey from other major producing nations on price, volume, and consistency. That export trade, however, brings the industry face to face with a separate product entirely, one that involves a far more intensive and technically demanding production process than honey itself: royal jelly. Where honey is a food bees produce for their own colony's general survival, royal jelly is something else altogether, a specialized secretion produced by young worker bees specifically to feed developing queen larvae. And it is this substance, rather than honey, that determines whether a developing bee grows into an ordinary, short-lived worker or into a queen capable of living many times longer while laying thousands of eggs. That striking biological difference, and the enormous value it places on a substance most consumers have barely heard of, is exactly where the next part of this story turns. Royal jelly occupies a strange position in the world of bee products, prized far beyond what its relatively obscure public profile might suggest, and understood by very few people outside the beekeeping industry itself. Unlike honey, which every colony produces as a matter of course to sustain itself through periods when flowers aren't blooming, royal jelly is produced by young worker bees for one specific biological purpose: feeding developing larvae that have been selected to become queens. The substance is remarkable for what it does inside the hive. A queen bee fed continuously on royal jelly throughout her development grows larger, matures faster, and goes on to live dramatically longer than an ordinary worker bee raised on a standard diet, despite both bees carrying essentially identical genetic material. The difference between a short-lived worker and a long-lived, prolifically egg-laying queen comes down almost entirely to this one substance and the volume in which it's fed during a critical developmental window early in the larva's life. That biological fact is exactly what beekeepers exploit, carefully and deliberately, to produce royal jelly in commercial quantities. In a natural hive, royal jelly production happens only when a colony needs to raise a new queen, a relatively rare event tied to swarming, colony loss, or seasonal requeening, and under normal circumstances, a colony might raise only a handful of queen cells across an entire year. Commercial royal jelly producers cannot wait for these rare natural triggers, so they engineer the same biological response artificially, and the process, once understood, reveals just how sophisticated commercial beekeeping in China has become, blending an intimate understanding of bee behavior with the kind of production line thinking more commonly associated with manufacturing than with agriculture. Beekeepers transfer very young larvae, typically no more than a day or two old, into artificial queen cups, small wax or plastic cells molded to mimic the shape and size of a natural queen cell. These prepared cups, often arranged in long rows along specialized grafting frames, are then placed into a specially prepared, queenless section of a strong, healthy colony. Deprived of their own queen and presented with larvae sitting in cells that visually and chemically signal queen potential, the worker bees respond according to deeply ingrained instinct, treating each larva as a future queen and flooding its cell with royal jelly in far greater quantity than that single larva could ever consume before reaching maturity. Because dozens of these artificial queen cups can be grafted and placed into a single hive at once, a beekeeper can trigger the production of far more royal jelly from one colony in a single cycle than that same colony would ever naturally produce across an entire season, simply by exploiting the worker bee's inability to distinguish an artificial setup from a genuine emergency requeening situation. This is the technique, refined and scaled across thousands of operations, that allows China to lead the world in royal jelly production by a wide margin. But the same characteristics that make China dominant in volume also introduce quality control challenges that don't affect ordinary honey production in nearly the same way. Because royal jelly commands a significantly higher price per unit than honey, sometimes by an order of magnitude when measured gram for gram, and because the artificial queen rearing technique can be pushed harder and faster than natural hive conditions would ever allow on their own. Some operations have turned to more aggressive methods to increase output. This includes the use of hormone treatments intended to stimulate colonies into producing even larger quantities of royal jelly than the standard artificial queen cup method alone would generate, essentially chemically nudging worker bee physiology to accelerate and intensify a process that already runs faster than nature intended once queen cups are introduced. This kind of intervention can affect both the purity and the nutritional consistency of the resulting product, since royal jelly's value to buyers rests heavily on its natural composition of proteins, sugars, fatty acids, and bioactive compounds, and any artificial manipulation of the bees producing it introduces variables that are difficult to standardize or verify from batch to batch. This stands in fairly sharp contrast to countries like New Zealand, where a smaller-scale but tightly regulated bee product industry, best known internationally for high-value Manuka honey, maintains stricter and more standardized harvesting protocols across a comparatively small number of producers, prioritizing verified purity and traceability over sheer production volume. The trade-off between these two models, one built for scale and one built for tightly controlled quality, defines much of the ongoing tension within the global royal jelly trade, with buyers in different markets weighing price against certainty of origin and purity in different ways, depending on how the product will ultimately be used. The harvesting process itself, once a colony has been stimulated to produce, follows a remarkably tight timeline that leaves little room for error or delay. After roughly 3 days of continuous feeding by attending worker bees, the queen cells contain their peak accumulated volume of royal jelly, representing the point at which the largest amount of jelly sits pooled around the developing larva, before the larva itself begins consuming more of it as it continues to grow and mature. This narrow window is when beekeepers must act, since delaying harvest even by a day or two allows the larva to consume progressively more of the accumulated jelly, meaningfully reducing the final yield collected from each cell. Timing an entire operation's harvest schedule around this 3-day window, particularly when working across dozens or hundreds of hives simultaneously, requires the kind of precise, calendar-driven coordination that looks less like traditional farming and more like a manufacturing production schedule, with staff moving methodically from hive to hive on a fixed rotation to ensure no batch of cells sits past its optimal collection point. Modern operations frequently use vacuum suction equipment to extract the jelly directly from each cell, a method that reduces both contamination risk and the physical damage to the surrounding wax structure compared to older manual extraction techniques that relied on small tools to scrape or squeeze jelly out of each individual cell by hand. The harvested product is immediately placed into cold storage, typically well below freezing, since royal jelly is considerably more perishable and nutrient-sensitive than honey, and begins degrading meaningfully at room temperature within a matter of hours, rather than the years or decades honey can withstand under proper conditions. This dramatic difference in shelf stability between honey and royal jelly, despite both substances originating from the same colonies and even the same individual worker bees at different points in their processing behavior, reflects just how different the two products are at a chemical level, with royal jelly carrying a much higher concentration of proteins and other compounds that are naturally prone to breakdown without consistent refrigeration. Even under ideal conditions, and with a strong, healthy colony working at full capacity, a single hive can typically produce only a modest amount of royal jelly over the course of a month. A yield constraint that helps explain why the product commands such a premium price relative to its relatively small physical volume compared to honey. Where a single, well-managed hive might produce many kilograms of honey across a full harvesting season, that same hive, dedicated instead to royal jelly production, yields only a fraction of that weight in jelly across a comparable period. And the added labor, precision, and cold chain infrastructure required to harvest and preserve it pushes the effective cost of production per kilogram far higher than honey ever approaches. That premium pricing, combined with the sheer scale of China's production capacity, has made royal jelly a significant export product, moving into pharmaceutical, cosmetic, and nutritional supplement markets across the world, where it's marketed for a range of purported health benefits. But that export success has also drawn sustained regulatory scrutiny from international buyers, who apply far stricter residue and purity standards than the domestic Chinese market has historically required. Import authorities in the United States and across the European Union have, at various points, identified antibiotic residues in shipments of Chinese royal jelly, findings that led directly to import restrictions and considerably stricter inspection requirements being placed on Chinese royal jelly entering those markets, sometimes affecting entire categories of shipments rather than isolated batches from a single producer. These residues generally trace back to the broader use of antibiotics in colony management, a practice sometimes employed to control bacterial disease within hives operating at industrial scale, where the sheer density of managed colonies and the stress of constant migratory movement and artificial queen cup manipulation can make colonies more vulnerable to certain bacterial infections than hives managed under lower intensity conditions. Antibiotic treatment addresses that vulnerability effectively in the short term, but it runs directly counter to the increasingly strict residue tolerances that many international food safety regulators apply to products marketed for both culinary and nutritional supplement use, where consumers and regulators alike expect a bee product to be free of pharmaceutical residue entirely, rather than simply below some permitted threshold. In response to these repeated regulatory setbacks, China's royal jelly industry has faced sustained pressure to tighten production standards, reduce reliance on both hormone stimulation and antibiotic treatment, and move toward the kind of traceable, standardized production protocols that would allow Chinese royal jelly to compete more directly on quality terms with smaller, more tightly regulated producers elsewhere in the world. Some larger, export-oriented operations have already begun adopting more rigorous internal testing and certification processes specifically to reassure international buyers and regain access to markets that previously restricted their products, recognizing that continued access to the highest-paying export markets depends on closing the gap between China's enormous production capacity and the purity standards that premium international buyers now expect as a baseline rather than an exception. Taken together, honey and royal jelly production in China represent two sides of the same enormous agricultural system. One built on volume, geographic diversity, and a migratory beekeeping tradition capable of chasing blooms across an entire continent-sized country, and the other built on a much more delicate, biologically engineered process capable of coaxing a colony into producing far more of a rare substance than nature alone would ever provide on its own. Both sides of that system face the same underlying tension between scale and quality, between the economic pressure to maximize output across millions of managed colonies and the increasingly demanding expectations of both domestic consumers and international regulators who want assurance that speed and volume haven't come at the cost of purity, safety, or the well-being of the bee colonies the entire system ultimately depends on. How China's beekeeping industry continues to navigate that tension as global demand for both honey and royal jelly keeps climbing year after year will likely determine whether the country's dominance in this space becomes even more entrenched in the decades ahead, or whether smaller, quality-focused producers elsewhere manage to carve out a lasting alternative built on trust